Paddy.
Laura Koonsberg, it's been a weekend of peacenik talk.
Peacenik talk is not the same as peacenik conclusion, but yes, peacenik talk. We talked yesterday, didn't we, about a ceasefire between India and Pakistan. And then late last night, a Vladimir Putin public address where he called for direct talks between Russia and Ukraine in Turkey in a matter of days. Whether or not that's going to turn into something real, we'll see. But he claimed he wants to have serious negotiations.
And there will be movement today because he was going to talk to President Erdogan of Turkey today. We'll talk more about that with Nick Watt. And we'll come home to the home front to talk about the Labour government's plans to be unveiled this week on immigration. All that in the Sunday newscast.
Hello, it's Laura in the studio.
It's Paddy in the studio.
And it's Nick in the studio.
Hello, Nick Watt.
The hardest working man in the world.
Not as hardworking as you,
Oh,
across
you're
your multiple BBC platforms, as they say.
Oh, he's a mere dilettante.
You're on all
That's
the
a very
time.
Newsnight word, isn't it? Oh, yes, and we can say you're on now, Newsnight. Oh, I've got two blokes from Newsnight across me. Crikey.
And a former Newsnight star.
Oh, yeah, that goes back to the 19th century. Anyway, plenty to talk about today. So, what are we starting with?
Well, I think we'd better start with the foreign news, which is that there's been a lot of sequencing. So the European leaders, including ours, because we are in Europe, if we're not in the EU.
Correct.
We were in Kyiv. Meanwhile, in Moscow, President Putin had President Xi, he had the Lula of Brazil, and he had his international allies. So that happened. They both did megaphone talks at each other. Then the Europeans said, you need to have a ceasefire within of 30 days or we'll put sanctions on. Then late last night, President Putin gave an address from the Kremlin unexpectedly saying, I know what, let's have face-to-face talks with Ukraine in Turkey.
And not long after that, President Zelensky went online and said it's a positive sign that the Russians have finally begun to consider ending the war. The entire world has been waiting for this for a very long time. And he says we expect Russia to confirm a ceasefire, full, lasting and reliable tomorrow, and Ukraine is ready to meet. So that looks, Nick, like there might be movement. Sets the scene for movement.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, there may well be movement. You know, you had, as Paddy said, those European leaders, including Keir Starmer in Kyiv, saying that it had to be an unconditional ceasefire. And there Vladimir Putin puts down a condition. But the condition he's put down is maybe not that unreasonable, which is face-to-face talks with Ukraine, as you say, I think, in Turkey on Thursday. Now, obviously, that is interesting that President Zelensky has given a positive welcome to what Vladimir Putin has said, because he absolutely does not trust him at all. And the supposed ceasefires we've had recently, 3-day one here, 3-day one there, President Zelensky has rejected those, saying they are not real at all. So are we moving into new territory? I mean, one really interesting thing, a point that was made, Paddy, on your show by Misha Glenny, is we've talked about all these leaders we've seen in Moscow, these leaders in Kyiv. There's one we haven't seen, Misha Glenny was saying, is Donald Trump. Now, what is going on there? Is there a shift in the US position to be slightly less supportive of Russia? I mean, interestingly, we had Lord Mandelson, Peter Mandelson, on Newsnight on Friday night, and he was saying, we believe we've slightly shifted Donald Trump to be a bit more critical of Russia. And you'll remember a few days ago, I think the wording that Donald Trump used was basically, is Vladimir Putin stringing me along? The phrase was, is he tapping me up? And so you wonder whether that the dynamics are shifting. And if Donald Trump is being less sort of sympathetic to Vladimir Putin, does that mean that he, Vladimir Putin, has got to do things that he wasn't thinking of doing a month ago?
So we can listen to Misha Glenny. He did a series called The Invention Of, which included the invention of Russia on Radio 4, which was a podcast series. It was very well loved by listeners for going to some of the primary colours here. And this is a primary colours moment because you've got all these very important statements. If for Vladimir Zelensky to call it positive when President Putin makes a rare Kremlin address after the European leaders have been, it's all sequencing. And so this is what Misha Glenny told us about Donald Trump's position.
The one person who was neither in Moscow nor in Kyiv was President Trump. And Trump, interestingly enough, whose team has been recently, in the past couple of months, tending to repeat Putin's talking points, has shifted somewhat over the past couple of days and saying that Putin might be tapping him, as he said, and basically trying to fool him. And according to Keir Starmer, the Americans may join in with the new sanctions against Russia, which would be punitive if the ceasefire doesn't start on Monday. So this is a shift.
I suppose it's worth saying to newscasters actually why this all matters, because you might think, well, why are we having micro discussions about tweets and statements and people popping up on TV and who's in which Kodak moment and which leaders are there? It's worth just remembering how much, not just instability the war in Ukraine has caused, but also how much turmoil it's caused economically for us. The energy price shock that's had a huge impact on our economy and on other economies, not least, of course, because of the ongoing suffering for Russian civilians and Russian military people and Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian military people caught up in this big conflict. So this is not just about a diplomatic dance that we're all watching incredibly closely and isn't it interesting, there's a nudge here and a nudge there. But I just wondered, we talked to Jeremy Bowman yesterday, Jeremy was pretty resolute in saying, look, unless the Russians basically have a sort of personality transplant about how they see their aims in Ukraine, nothing's really going to shift here.
Yes, I mean, you do sense with Vladimir Putin is that when he changes and you think, well, that's a slight change, is that a tactical change rather than a strategic change? Is that because there's a slightly different sound coming out of the White House, so he then has to say something that makes us think, oh, is he being positive? But, let's not forget what the Russian war aims are. The Russian war aims is that Ukraine should cease to function as a sovereign
country,
state.
yeah.
And, those, because when he talks about, we need to address the causes of the conflict. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, the causes of the conflict. What's that? That's the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine becoming a sovereign state, the world and Russia accepting that it would be a sovereign state, and they want to change that. So you should never forget that. And it's interesting what you're saying about, what does this mean to us? Obviously a terrible, terrible loss of life on the European continent. But if Vladimir Putin still does have those war aims, which is Ukraine should cease to exist, where next? What about the Baltic states? They're in the European Union. They're in NATO. What does it mean for Poland? Where next? So it has real life meaning and consequences for the whole European continent.
So we are reporting big international news, the statement of Vladimir Putin, the statement of Volodymyr Zelensky, and the role of the British Prime Minister in Kyiv this weekend. And now, with that all said, we will come scampering home to immigration policy in the UK, which has been, in the official words, a complete and utter fiasco for as many years as I can remember, because every government says it's going to do X and then never does.
Indeed so. And there is reason, whether or not as an individual you actually care about high levels of immigration, there's good reason for citizens to look at what politicians have done and think, well, that was indeed a fiasco, because you've had successive governments promise one thing, do another, meant to bring immigration down under 100,000 under David Cameron. That was a failure. People then voted for control of immigration in the Brexit referendum. It then went up to nearly 1 million in 2023. It's since then come down, but immigration is one of those issues. It's hard to solve. Our politicians keep making promises to people about solving it, and then they do not. And in the words of one Number 10 insider this week to me, they said, the public has been gaslit on this for years. Yes, that was their word. They've been gaslit on this. And politicians say one thing, and then nothing changes. And it's particularly fraught for Labour to see if they can keep their promise this time, because they've got Farage's Reform UK on their heels. And before we get into any of that detail, Nick, I think it's really interesting that both the big parties in this country, both the government and indeed the Conservatives, are now pretty much saying the whole approach successive governments have had to immigration, that it's good for the economy, was wrong. And this is how Yvette Cooper addressed that earlier.
But if that approach was right, we would have seen, when we saw that soaring level of net migration, that soaring level of overseas recruitment, well, surely we would have seen soaring growth alongside it, and we didn't. Actually, what we saw was the economy flatline, because by failing to invest in UK workers, that also undermines productivity, it undermines the ability to get people back into the work who are currently not working. So alongside those record highs of overseas recruitment, we also had this big increase in people just not working here in the UK.
So the plans then, Nick?
Yeah, so it's the white paper on immigration, as you say, tomorrow. This will have a particular focus on what some people call legal migration, other people call regular migration. And I think that Yvette Cooper said something pretty significant on your show, Laura, which is no new visas for people who want to work in the care system. Well, how will you get people working in the care system? One is, I think she said, there's 10,000 people who came on those visas who could work in the care system. And the second big thing Yvette Cooper said is we need to skill up the UK workforce. And this is a huge, huge thing that goes to the heart of this problem, because one of the big things you heard in the Brexit referendum is it's just been such an easy way to fix the economy is you bring in workers from overseas. What we should do in the era of Brexit, we were told, is skill up the UK workforce. Did that happen? No, it didn't. They went for the quick and easy fix of bringing migrant workers in. And Yvette Cooper is saying that there is going to be a big, big push to skill up the UK workforce. Now, to do that, you need something called long-term planning and long-term strategy, which this government... Sorry, not this government, this country, whoever's in government, is not very good at, because we're always for the short-term fix of how can we get economic growth. So you have Keir Starmer believes his government will live or die on economic growth, but doing something to address the long-term impact, political impact of immigration, a long-term plan of skilling up the workforce, which successive governments have really struggled to do.
Because Rishi Sunak says he got it wrong to say, as one of his mission statements, stop the boats. He said, I couldn't do it. I should not have said that. So how struck are you by Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, saying we're going to stop care worker visas? How much of a big pledge is that?
I was surprised at how explicit she was about that. So what we're expecting, what we know is coming in the white paper, is employers will have to show, they'll have to prove they really, 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 really can't get domestic staff before they're able to bring people in from abroad. People who want to come here on a skilled worker visa are going to be expected to have degree level education. People who come here for work are going to have to show that they have got better levels of spoken English and English understanding. Also, if any overseas person commits a crime here, the Home Office is going to be notified. And Yvette Cooper told us this morning she would be doing much more to get people out of the country if they were here working for whatever reason and they got involved in crime. I'd say I was surprised by how explicit she was at that one sector. And I think while some people might welcome it, I think it's quite a hostage to fortune. You know, our inbox is often full of people who work in the care sector saying we can't get staff. Care homes are shutting because we can't make ends meet. We can't afford to pay people the increased minimum wage, let alone deal with some of the new labour regulations that are coming down the track. You know, this is a sector that's already under intense pressure. And I think there's going to be a real question for the government about where why are they sure that the sector will be able to manage without bringing more people in from abroad? Worth saying, though, that the Tories had already toughened up the terms of this visas, and the number of people coming in under care worker visas was already falling off quite dramatically.
And if you are a newscaster with knowledge of this subject, definitely get in touch with us. I mean, one thing I would say that sounds a bit sort of touchy-feely is that migrants are people. So there will be people listening with names and proud working jobs here who might think, am I a migrant, or do I have a name? Do I have a life, a backstory? So I think one thing to get right is that it's the numbers and the British government's failure to do what it says that's why this is a conversation. Many of us would not want to come over as just branding 1 million people with a name that isn't people. But Tony Blair said years ago that accessing EU countries, the populations of those countries could move in. He was urged at the time to put a brake on that. He did not. You've then refreshed what the Conservatives did. So the reason why this issue comes up, and to people who are listening who are migrants into our country, is because for the British electorate, they feel they've been told lies by successive governments, and that explains the anger in the country about it, and that's why we're always talking about it.
I mean, it was the accession of the 10 new member states from Eastern Europe and the 2 Mediterranean islands in 2004, and we had the right, as any member state, to put what was known as 7-year transitional controls on migration from those countries. Germany did it, France did it, we didn't. We didn't because it was the historic UK mission, championed by Margaret Thatcher, to expand the European Union. But there were studies done at the time saying that it would be a very, very small number of people who came.
13,000 was the number that the government quoted at the time, which wasn't a government official estimate, but they used the 13,000. And it was hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of thousands.
Absolutely millions. And I can remember Patrick Winter and I for The Guardian, we did a huge, one of these long reads on this issue. It was one of the earliest pieces on has Labour got immigration right? What about the numbers? It was a big thing. And I can remember in the course of research for that, I can remember talking to a reasonably senior member of Gordon Brown's government. It was just a few years after the accession. Sitting, I can remember I was in, it was a sunny room in Strasbourg. So there must have been a meeting of the European Parliament. And it was at the moment when it was pretty clear that the numbers coming from the new member states of the European Union were quite large. And this member of the cabinet said, but you don't understand it. It's absolutely amazing because we have these people coming over with these really great skills. They're doing low-skilled jobs, keeps the wages down. It's absolutely amazing. But other members of that government, people like John Denham, was saying, look at the social impact.
And then this is where we found ourselves now, with politicians in both our big parties really shifting to now saying that actually immigration can not just sometimes make cohesion difficult when you're absorbing large numbers of people very, very rapidly into society, but also that economically, sometimes large numbers of immigration gives you, weird effects, and it can actually undermine the economy. And that's a big, big shift that I think you can see it from space now.
Yeah, and we are not alone in having a massive migration debate in the country. The Germans, who took 4 million Syrians in, are even talking about sending them back. So you've got this situation where all over Europe, this is a live button topic, and it involves all of our lives, people we know.
I think we also should spell out that the government always said that they were going to do this. And Keir Starmer made a sort of attempted to be dramatic press conference back in November when it was revealed that the immigration numbers had hit a record 900,000 in 2023. So this white paper and these plans have been long in the making. But the political landscape here has also really changed during that time. And, would they be doing this anyway if it weren't for the Reform Party's advance? Yes, they would. Would it feel quite such an urgent political mission for this government? It probably would not. And I just wonder, Nick, it's something that people have kind of said quite often online in some of the discussions around this. Actually, why is Labour doing this? Because they're losing more votes to the Lib Dems and Greens if you look at the raw numbers. But my impression is how people in Downing Street see the threat is much more intense to them from Reform than from those other parties, from the sort of progressive side of society, if you like.
Yeah, they basically see the red wall turning into a light blue wall, which is the Reform colour. And it was the red wall. That was the absolutely key strategy of their general election campaign. Morgan McSweeney, the chief of staff, the brains behind that campaign, talking about the hero voters, those voters who felt alienated from Labour on Brexit and immigration, came back to Labour last summer, and they think they're now going to reform. I mean, essentially what happened in the local elections, was it last week?
It was only last week. Well, this is why this is all happening in this environment.
And the Runcorn and Helsby by-election is that for both of the two main parties, it was an absolutely sobering experience. For Labour, it was a sobering experience on the means testing and winter fuel. And for both parties, it was a completely sobering moment for them on immigration. And what they heard again and again and again on the doorsteps is exactly what you said, Laura, at the very beginning of this edition of Newscast, which is we've been told one big thing by politicians for 20 years, they're going to bring it down, and it hasn't happened. And that's why before these local elections, Reform, yeah, they're doing quite well. Interesting in the polls. We're heading to midterm. Maybe it's a bit theoretical. No. Tanks on lawn. Get moving.
And here is a good stat. So I was writing about this, and so I thought I'd look up the numbers. Because it is an interesting debate. If you look at the raw numbers, you think, well, loads of Labour voters have gone the other way to the Lib Dems and Greens. Shouldn't they be worrying about that too? But of course, where votes are is just as important as how many there are. Now, Labour, at the general election, there were only 6 seats where Labour won and the Lib Dems were second. There were 89 seats where Labour won and Reform was second. So if you're screaming at your podcast and thinking, but what about the threats from the other parties? Labour shouldn't be herring after these voters. That's the reason why, rightly or wrongly, that is the reason why they are having such a focus on this agenda.
Yeah, it's the numbers of seats where they are. It's the red wall.
Yeah.
Now, I love a fact because I can then steal it.
Tremendous.
And I will then say, I remember the 89 seats where Reform came second. So thank you for that. Now, you also took Yvette Cooper's appearance on the television to go into the subject of grooming gangs. And I've been reading about it in my Sunday Times. There's a big report in there if you're looking for a tip about where's the journalism on this today. And the other journalism is in Laura Kuenssberg's programme today.
Yes, so everybody will remember how the grooming gang scandal re-emerged as an incredibly hotly debated political issue at the beginning of this year, where you had the world's richest man, Elon Musk, appearing to stir it up in the UK, Nigel Farage, and others here really going after the government on this, and the Conservatives also pushing the government again and again to have a national inquiry that was repeatedly turned down. The government commissioned Dame Louise Casey to do what was called a rapid review. That was commissioned in January. It didn't get going until the middle of February, but we expect now it's going to emerge into public in the next couple of weeks. So this issue is on its way back. And we wanted to hear from some of the people who've been affected by this. And one of the victims of this heinous crime, who was abused from the age of 12, she's called Steph. Her story was in the Channel 4 documentary on this a few weeks ago, but she decided in speaking to us to waive her anonymity and to go public with her face shown to the camera for the very first time. And we wanted to hear that story this morning with this issue coming back to the political arena. And we wanted to hear what one of the people who'd actually been affected had been through. This is some of what she had to say.
I was screaming out for help. No one was listening to me. It's like I self-sabotage myself.
What would you like then to happen now?
I want justice like we was promised. I don't want him to, no one's taking accountability for it.
She's just found her voice after 20 years. She told me what had happened 20 years ago. That's the scandal here.
The other voice you heard there was Maggie Oliver, who was the detective that Steph went to and met all those years ago. And then she turned into a campaigner on this issue because she found wherever she turned, people didn't want to listen. People didn't want to listen in the police. People didn't want to listen in politics. And for years and years and years, this scandal went largely undiscussed until journalists started covering it really in the early 2010s. But we asked Yvette Cooper, essentially, is the government being urgent enough on all of this? They've said they're going to get on with lots of recommendations that have been made, but there's no clear timeline on some of them. And clearly, as you heard there from the victims, there's this sense that actually, even after all this time, people just don't get it.
So the immediate action that we've taken, that I think is probably the most important, is to fund increased police investigations and to also to call on every police chief constable in the country to now review what they are doing and to reopen closed cases where no further action was taken, because we need that police investigation to pursue those perpetrators and prevent those crimes taking place, including historic crimes as well as crimes that are still taking place. But of course, you are right. There is more that we need to do, and that's why the Louise Casey report, I think, will set out really the scale of the challenge nationally. As you know, with Louise, she does no-holds-barred reports and very hard-hitting.
One of the things I've heard to my face is that grooming gangs are going on now. It would be wrong for us to think, oh, this dreadful thing that happened in the past. The people who know about this subject tell me this is happening now.
And Steph said that in our interview. She said, I see it. She said, I see young girls and I want to go and drag them away. I see this happening to young girls like it happened to me. And Yvette Cooper pretty much acknowledged on air this morning too that this is still happening.
In terms of where the government's going, I thought Yvette Cooper said something really interesting to you, Laura, which is that she says, I'm worried about how big this problem is, which plays into what you were saying, Paddy. We're going to get the Louise Casey review. And as Yvette Cooper said, Louise Casey says what she thinks. She doesn't sort of think, what do they want me to say? She's going to say what she thinks. As I understand it, and I reported on Newsnight a couple of weeks ago, it looks like this report is going to have details of the level of grooming in parts of the country where a national sort of examination of the data hasn't happened. And one of the big places it's going to come up with, I'm told, is London. It's also, I'm told, going to have figures on Leeds, Glasgow and Cardiff. Now, if the government were of a mind that it wanted to come off its view, its position, that there's no need for a national inquiry into grooming gangs because we have the national inquiry into child abuse. If they believe that it's time to come off that, it may well be that the Louise Casey review gives them enough for them to change their position. I'm not saying they're going to do that, but when you hear Yvette Cooper saying to you, Laura, I'm worried about the scale of this, and as I understand it, we're going to have details and data on big cities in the UK that have not had a sort of a national eye looking at it, you may well find that various positions may change.
And I just wonder, though, I have every expectation that the debate in Westminster around a national inquiry will begin probably before the report's even published. It was interesting, though, talking to Maggie Oliver and to Steph. Neither of them want there to be a national inquiry. Maggie Oliver, who's campaigned on this for 20 years, she says, we know what needs to be done. We know where it's happening. We've seen it. We've known it for years. And actually, all the politicking around whether there should be an inquiry, this, that and the other, actually, that's not what she wants.
Wow.
She wants people to get on with sorting out the crime that is happening under people's noses and go after people who have been perpetrators over the years that haven't been investigated properly. Thank you very much for being with us, Nick. Thank you very much, newscasters, for being with us as ever.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.